Now, usually when I get up here at the beginning of a meetup, I talk about the things that have happened in Angular. And I was looking over the things that have happened in Angular over the last couple weeks since our last meetup, and there are a couple cool things, but I'm not going to spend too much time on there because they're not that many. We're rapidly converging on version 1.3. There are something like 54 different pull requests that went in that are addressing performance in the platform. And what we're seeing is that we're rapidly converging on the final version of 1.3. Our intention is that this 1.3 will be the thing that holds everybody over, hopefully, until we get to Angular 2.0. And so what you're going to see from us is less and less focus on AngularJS and Angular Dart in their current incarnations, and more real code coming out for 2.0. So the next time we have something important to say, it will probably be about Angular 2.0 and not about one of the current branches. Now this might be terrifying because we all depend on them. We will still do bug fixes. Please send in requests for things that we must pay attention to. But all of the interesting new feature work is going to be into the 2.0 branch. And we'll come back in November or December and give you an update on where we are on that. All right, with that, I'd like to invite Rahul up, going to talk us through on how we internationalize AngularJS.
Thanks. All right, so I seem to have lost my slides. There we go. Awesome. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it means to actually internationalize your application, right? It's a lot more than just taking translations, which is the common misconception that you literally all you got to do is translate your app from English to French and you're done, right? It's a lot more. It's a lot deeper than just like modifying your client-side application. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the pitfalls, what really goes into internationalizing an app, and how you go about it in like a methodical manner, so that all your various stakeholders are happy and it's easy for everybody to do. So let's go through the agenda a little bit. So first I'll take you through these words that you keep looking at, which is I18N and L10N, what they really mean. Next, why multilingual support is increasingly more important. I'll go over some current efforts, briefly touch upon things like the ECMAScript Internationalization API, some other open source projects that are out there. And then we'll dive deeper into how you come about thinking up a solution depending on your requirements, what stakeholders are involved. Ending with, of course, the Angular, what I think is the right approach to doing things, the Angular way, leveraging things that Angular already provides. We're not going to try and reinvent the wheel here. If they have two-way binding, let's use it. Let's not build our own like conflicting templating engine and then try and use that within the Angular framework. It just ends up being more messy than the trouble is worth. So first, let's talk about these words, right? So I18N, if you look on Wikipedia, is the short form of internationalization, which actually is the process of adapting your software or your application so that you can start localizing the application, right? It's not actually doing the translations or adapting to different regions and their quirks. It's just structure that you build when you're thinking about starting to localize. And then if you look at what localization is, that's the meat, right? That's when you actually say, OK, now we're going to support French, or we're going to deploy our application to users in Japan. And what are the steps that we need to take in order to make sure that they have a good experience, that they have the same experience in their region that they're comfortable with as your original user base in the United States would have when they opened your application. So these I18N and L10N are just numeronyms. They are basically just taking the letters between I and N, the number of letters, and putting them all together. So it's I18 letters and then N. Similarly, L and then 10 letters and then N. So you could take my name, for example, and make it R3D D3I, which sounds kind of like a Star Wars droid, but it's really just a numeronym. So now let's talk about why multilingual support is more and more important. So if you talk to people in the industry, people who are talking at things like ICANN's global forums, they'll tell you that the next billion users of the internet will be people who increasingly don't speak English or aren't comfortable with using English as the primary language of communication, right? So think about Facebook's push right now to bring affordable internet to places that have never known what computers are or the internet is. Google's doing the same thing with things like the Google X Balloon project to bring Wi-Fi to remote regions. And all of these people probably aren't comfortable using English, right? They use English as a broken language, but they're mostly using regional dialects, local languages that they've been speaking with their families for generations, right? And so how do we, once you get English, how do you, once they have internet, how do you actually get them to engage with your application or start using your application, right? So I have a couple of links, like just buzzwords with one article talks about how English is no longer the language of the web. Another talks about how Chinese users will actually overtake English-speaking users by 2015. Another one that talks about the new internet, the one that's going to be for the next 2 billion users that are outside of developed nations. There's a couple more links that I'll go over in the resources if I still have time. So let's talk a little bit about the current efforts within the context of Angular. Right? There's a lot of stuff with jQuery. There's a lot of stuff with other libraries, but we'll talk about the confines of Angular. So first, there's the $locale service that AngularJS natively provides, which is pretty simple. Then there's the ECMAScript Internationalization API. That's this sort of standard that's not been ratified. It's only present in a few browsers, and it's not entirely polyfillable. And then there's community-driven projects like, I'm sure you've heard of Angular GetText or Angular Translate. And then there's other online tutorials that will walk you through some of the things that are involved in building out a solution. So let's look at $locale, right? So $locale is pretty simple. All it does is it takes a region ID, and it outputs a bunch of rules that that region follows for number formatting, date formatting, how many decimals to use by default for the precision, the decimal separator, whether it's a comma, a dot, a pipe. I don't think there's a pipe anywhere, but for example, things like that, right? And you mostly leverage $locale through filters. So if you take the currency filter, for example, right, it appends the currency symbol automatically to whatever number you input. And that currency symbol will be decided based on what locale you're choosing to support. Similarly with date, you have a string that you can format the date yourself. But then they also have things like short date, long date. And these are nothing but aliases to the localized version of the short form of the date in that region, right? So for example, in the US, we put month, day, and then year. In India, we do day, month, year, right? So short date in India will output something different from short date in the United States. Next, let's talk about the ECMAScript API, right? So this is, again, fairly similar to the $locale service, but of course, think of it as $locale is polyfilling within the confines of Angular what you would otherwise miss if you were just using vanilla JavaScript, right? The only notable exception that the internationalization API provides natively is something called collation. And collation is actually quite important if you think about it. So collation basically means that when you read a list or you sort a list, you're sorting the list based on the language that you're reading the list in, right? So think of it this way. Let's say you're sorting a list of countries, right? In English, the countries read A, B, C. But in French, the countries read B, C, A, right? Now, when you sort in ascending order and you're reading the list in English, you expect to see A, B, C. But if you sorted the same list in ascending order in French, but with the English version of the names, you would see not ascending order for that list, right? So you always want to make sure that you support you're sorting in whatever languages you want to support. And the ECMAScript API just has a useful method that does that for you. You basically just give it a data set and you give it a key on which to sort, and then it knows that for different regions based on some rules what goes where, or if country names are spelled differently in different languages, how to approach that kind of situation, right? Now, that's all part of version 1, and that's ES5. But ES6 is going to support slightly more common use cases like substituting things within your string, right? Think of it as a template for a string output, and then you substitute it, right? A simple example would be, let's say you log in to a console in the browser, right? And it says, welcome username, right? So imagine if you had to, at like compile time, take all your users in your database and make like a welcome X for each one of those users. You'll be loading like tens of thousands of strings into memory and it's not efficient because you're only going to use one out of those 10,000 strings every time your user logs in, right? So what you want to do is substitute a variable and use a template to get the completed string. And that's something that ES6 edition 2 of the Internationalization API will support. Now let's look at open source libraries. So there, like I said, Angular getText and Angular Translate are well known. They're pretty popular. They're commonly used. But there are a couple of drawbacks that I feel kind of take away from the Angular way of doing things. And also, I don't think they're terribly easy to understand or develop against, especially when you bring into the mix your translators, right? I don't think anybody expects the developers to not only know Java, C++, and JavaScript, but also now know English. Well, they hopefully know English, but French, Japanese, Chinese, et cetera, right? So you'll get translators in to help you ease through the process. And that's when you'll run into trouble when you're dealing with some of these libraries. So for example, getText actually extracts, you build your app as though you're writing only for English, and then it extracts all the strings from your app, tries to guess the strings, and make sure that there's no redundancy, and then uses those exact strings as keywords. So you use a lot of, you kind of lose a lot of the, what do you want to say, a lot of the dynamic stuff that Angular provides, like two-way binding on the fly, using stuff within directives, because literally getText will only pick up what's within p tags or span tags or stuff that it expects, or button tags, which it expects will have text inside it. But the minute you try and fill something, like if you try and pluralize using getText, you can't use Angular's pluralization. You have to rely on getText pluralization and stuff like that. And similar with Angular Translate, they use something that was developed by IBM called a message format. And that's sort of like the ECMAScript API, where it provides its own internal rule set for how to do certain things. And this takes away from being able to leverage $locale to give you back those rules and have it be coherent with the rest of your filters, whether you're using date, currency in the app. And also you lose, because of message format, again, two-way bindings, interpolation. Message format has a different way of doing templating, stuff like that. So like I said before, trying to use a bunch of somewhat conflicting technologies just leads to more pain than it's worth. So at that point, it's just better to say, OK, yeah, I'm just going to roll out my own, or I'm going to do some more research and try and figure this out myself, right? And tutorials will kind of take you some of the way, but you got to really take tutorials from 10 different locations and put them all together to stitch up a whole picture and say, OK, here's a solution that solves 99% of my problems, and I can kind of easily go through it, walk my developers through how to deploy it, engineer it, and maintain it. So we're trying to basically eliminate most of these issues by just taking a library that's built in using the right approaches. It's kind of opinionated. It follows the basic ethos of how Angular works, and put that into practice, right? With that, let's start talking about how to think up a solution, right? What actually makes a good solution? Because obviously, at this point, what's out there isn't complete, isn't whole, doesn't work well in a lot of cases. So what does work well, right? So the first thing you want to know is that, like I mentioned before, internationalization is a part of your infrastructure, right? It's not something you build on. It's not something that you can tack on later without incurring significant cost and significant pain and refactor at times. So you want to start thinking about it as early as possible in your app, because there's a lot of stakeholders. It's not just developers. You'll be talking to PMs about this. You'll find yourself dealing with designers over certain aspects of it. And of course, also translators need to be involved at some point or the other, right? So the sooner you start, the better, right? Think of it this way. If you're just think of translations, you have a 10-page app with 100 strings a page, and you have a single-page app with 15 strings on that login page that you just built. You're going to be translating 1,000 strings in one case versus 15 strings in another case, and you can figure out which one is easier to deal with. So let's talk about some of the things that are common pitfalls when you're starting to build out the solution. So the first is that you should always think in terms of phrases or word lengths, and not individual words in individual languages, right? Let's take this example of the word desktop in English, right? So imagine a use case where you have 3 checkboxes, one for mobile, one for desktop, and one for tablet, right? And you just check them off depending on what devices you want to support, right, in some sort of console. Now, they're all in one line, right? So the word desktop in English, what do you think is going to be in French, right? Simple word, desktop, right? It translates to the string in French, right? And now the reason is because in French, the literal translation of desktop in all cases means a table. In order to say PC, you actually have to say desktop computer. And desktop computer is this large string in French. So now, on a slightly smaller screen, or if you're doing responsive design, you're going to see one of your checkboxes drops to the next line. It looks kind of ugly because it's no longer aligned. It's just an overflow wrapping. And things are going to break. You won't realize until you start supporting a new language 6 months in the future. So this is where you need to involve designers and say, OK, a better solution would be just have a stack of checkboxes, 1 checkbox per line. And that way, as much as your string grows, in German it could be even longer, you're OK, right, for the most part. I don't know how to turn this off. I'm sorry. So let's take another example. OK, this word in German, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, right? In English, it actually looks kind of OK. It translates to Danube Steamship Company Captain, which the lengths are sort of similar. So you can work with that, right? It's not going to be 100% the same, but you can work with it. So it just goes to show that sometimes the things that you expect will break actually end up being OK. And like simple things like desktop that you expect will be like fine in whatever language you choose are going to actually cause your app to break down. The next thing you want to do is, like I said, treat each bunch of text as a phrase and not as individual words, right? So think about the previous example of Danube Steamship Company Captain. When you switch that to German, it's one word. So in that case, if you're constructing a string from 4 different words, what happens to the other 3 words when you move from English to German, right? Similarly, when you're trying to construct words and you're trying to keep the order the same, you're going to try to translate word for word, and it can go horribly wrong. So take this example of my name is Rahul Doshi, simple enough string, 5 words. And if you try to translate it word for word in Hindi, it ends up being Mera, name for naam, is hai, and my name stays the same. So if you look at the placement of hai in the 2 situations, the first one is actually grammatically incorrect, and the second one is actually correct. So again, you want to treat like my name is as one template or one phrase, and then change that phrase in each language that you choose to support, instead of trying to construct these long phrases from like shorter words, no matter how tempting it might seem, right? You might end up with like a paragraph of text and be like translating literally a paragraph of text instead of translating individual sentences or individual words when you're moving from language to language, right? The other reason why I say that people should always try and stick to this approach is because in other languages, many times you'll find that depending on the context of the sentence or the paragraph, you'll be using a different word to signify the same meaning, right? So it's very, very common in Chinese where you have like 10 different words that all mean the same thing, but if you're talking to somebody who's older than you, you say one. If you're talking to somebody who's younger than you, you say another. If you're talking to a coworker or a boss, you use yet another word. And so you tend to keep the context when you try and translate paragraphs or phrases, and you end up losing the context in a lot of situations when you don't do this. The other thing that I think is really, really important is your backend plays a role. So that's yet another stakeholder in your entire localization, internationalization efforts, right? Remember how I talked about collation. So imagine you're querying your API, and obviously your API is doing all the server-side sorting, pagination, search. Now you want to make sure that no matter which language you query your API in, you get back the right set of results for the sort operation or the search operation that you're doing, right? If you're searching, if you're searching against name and the user is typing in like a French word, the name is not going to be then the English version of the English column of name. It's going to be then the French column. But if you're always searching on the English column, you're going to never get any results back, and that's a problem. Similarly with sort, thinking back to the collation example, you sort in English, but your user is searching in French, you're going to end up with a result set that's not correct, right? So you need to make sure that some way your API knows what language the user is using when he's querying your API. And the API server needs to also start building out some sort of solution to this problem at the same time that you're doing this on the client side. You just need to involve them, let them know that this is going to happen. It needs to be supported, and if it's not, then there's going to be problems caused, not today, not tomorrow, but 6 months, 1 year from now when you start supporting languages other than English, or if you're an Indian app, Hindi, or if you're a Chinese app like Alibaba, you start with Chinese and then you grow, right? The last thing to remember is that make sure your components that are third-party components or things that you build yourself also are localization friendly. We all love using third-party libraries, and they're pretty great. But just make sure that they support things like Unicode text input, date-time formatting. In the case of time, depending on which region you're in, maybe they use 12-hour format, 24-hour format. With date-time, we already went over the different formats that are followed. But just make sure that your components can reconcile like date times and time zones from your API server and your UI, right? Your API server might always send back a Unix timestamp, but then depending on where the user is or how they save the data, they want to be able to read out the data in the same way. They might read it in PST, or they might read it in UTC, depending on where they are, or give them an explicit option to choose the time zone as well, right? Something like that. So this leads us to the problem of actually figuring out where the user is, right? What does he prefer? Does he prefer English? Does he prefer French? Does he prefer Chinese? How do you go about actually getting this information to begin with, right? So if you talk to Marco, who's a web developer at Mozilla, he'll tell you that there's no 100% way of reliably getting this information. There are a couple of hacks that we'll talk about, but they're not the right answer, right? So you've done this 1,000 times. You make a new data object, and then you do date.toLocale string, right? ToLocale string automatically does the magic of returning a date in the format of that region. So this is all well and good when you have a computer you bought yourself, you bought it in the place where you're living, everything's configured as per your criteria. But what if you're traveling? What if you're at an internet cafe in Japan and you're opening up your email, right? You don't want to see suddenly like Japanese characters all over the place and all the times don't sync up. Or you're borrowing a friend's computer and he's visiting from New York and the times still don't sync up. So what you want to do is just ask the user, right? There are some hacks like getting the navigator language, the browser language, the accept header, but all of these ultimately tie down to the OS's settings for region and locale. And if, let's say, you have a work computer where you don't have admin rights to change this data, it's going to implicitly be incorrect when your browser sends your client the request, right? So just ask them, and then cookie them, or save it in local storage, whatever you want to do. And that way, whenever he clears the session or he logs out of the public computer at the internet cafe, the session data will be wiped. When your app starts up again, it'll just ask you again for the first time, hey, we noticed, or like if you're in your email and, hey, we noticed that you're in a different time zone from what you're currently set to. Do you want to use that time zone, or do you want to continue using your old time zone, for example, right? So just ask them once, save that info, and then once you have the cookie, you can send your API server the language cookie with each request, and then the API server knows that, OK, I'm going to start searching in French, or I'm going to start searching in Japanese, right? So we use this thing called a language tag very often without realizing what it is. And it's basically a short way of signifying a lot of information. So you guys have all seen stuff like en-us, capital FR. And this is nothing but a language tag. And it's basically split into two parts. The part before the hyphen refers to the language, and the part after the hyphen refers to the region in which it's used. So a way of reading en-us is English as spoken in the United States, which is different from en-GB, which is English as spoken in the UK, right? Where they have COLOUR instead of COLOR and HUMOUR, which is what I was familiar with until I came here as well. So that's a nice way of that's what you would ideally store in your cookie or send to your API server, because it gives them all the information they need, the language and the region, And and based on that mapping, you can pull up all the rules based on like number formatting, currency formatting. And in fact, language tags are also what the $locale service, if you go back to my slides, uses, right? So you would pass $locale a language tag, and $locale would tell you, OK, here's the rules that I know of for this particular language. So now let's talk about the Angular way of doing things, right? What's the alternative that encapsulates all of this and makes it easy for you to use at least a part, right? Not the API server side of things, but at least the client-side stuff makes it really simple to do the client-side stuff that you want that I've already talked about. So we're going to talk, I'll talk about the architecture, and then I'll walk you guys through some examples. So our architecture is going to be really, really simple. It's going to be a bunch of flat JSON files, one for each language you support. And these files will be split up because we all know that Angular is single page, and it will otherwise load the entire JSON file on page load, which, think about it, if you have a big app, you have like 10,000, 20,000 strings that you're trying to translate. That's more than like 1 or 2 megabytes of data that's going to come in on page load and significantly slow down your page. When in reality, all the user might do is log in, check the notifications, and then exit the app, right? So they basically use 100 of those 10,000 strings, and you've loaded 2 megs for nothing. So we're going to split them up based on the route or the module, depending on your preference, that you've broken your Angular app into. And then we're going to put all these split up files into a folder, and the folder will be the locale that you want to support. It'll be the language tags. So you'll have ENUS, FRFR, JPJP, depending on the languages you support. So it looks a little bit like this, right? You have the locale or the language folder. Under that, you have a folder for each locale you want to support. And within that, you have mirrors of each file that has been translated from one language to the next. And this is the flat JSON file. It's really simple. It's just a key, which is unique to that module that defines the string you wish to translate. And then the value is nothing but the translated version of that value. So let's look at the first approach that you take to building this out. So let's build a service that caches all your strings as you load them up, because you obviously don't want to keep loading the same files again and again. So we know that services are persistent, so it's a good way of storing a cache of sort in memory of all the strings you've loaded. And then it'll expose methods that will allow you to get the translated value of a key, the ability to set or get the currently set locale. And a good way of notifying you when a resource file has been loaded into memory and is ready for use, right? Because what you don't want to do is try and use get a translated value for a key when the key hasn't been loaded into memory yet. So this is a really simple example, and stop me if you guys think that you need me to go more into detail with these examples. But there's a couple more advanced use cases that I'll actually go into the plunker. But the rest of them, I've left the slides online, and I have links to every single example's plunker, so you guys can open the links, play around with it, change it, see what breaks, what doesn't break. And I'll share all the links with you guys at the end of the talk. I'll put them on the meetup. I'll just leave a comment on the meetup group with the links, so that'll be useful for you guys. So our first approach, like I said, is just employing a service, right? So in our controller, we just have an object, which is the mapping of all the strings that we wish to use. And then we wrap all our getters to the localized versions of the keys in a ready function. So this is nothing but a promise that will resolve once the file has been loaded into memory. So if you look at this use case, it's basically once the common dictionary file has been loaded into memory, we're going to get the string, which is referred to as the token common.helloworld. So we always use the convention file name dot key name, right? So it's common is the file name, and then key name is hello world. And in your HTML, you just use simple two-way binding to bind to your hello world string, right? And then when the digest cycle runs again and again, at some point it'll pick up that hello world has been loaded, and that's it. You'll see hello world on the page. So, but this is a little bit clunky, right? Because one, you have to always wrap your stuff in locale ready. Two, if somebody forgets to listen in on like language changes, then your strings will never refresh, right? So let's say you load all your strings once in English, and then somebody changes your app to Japanese. Unless you like explicitly say, oh, when the language changes, you watch on the get locale, and every time that changes, you reinitialize all your scope.strings. It becomes kind of clunky, and when you have like hundreds of strings, your controller code is going to grow and grow and grow, and somebody inevitably is going to forget to either wrap in a locale ready or listen in on those change events, and you're not going to catch that bug until some user in like Argentina says, oh, okay, this doesn't work in Spanish anymore. So Angular provides filters, right? And we all know filters are a good way of like displaying text on the page that you don't really want to interact with the controller or modify stuff on the controller. It's just a way of showing something in a different manner, right? So we introduced this thing called an I18N filter. All the filter does is internally calls out to the get localized string function. And you just pipe to the filter your token name, right, the key name. Now, in this case, the filter actually doesn't do a ready call, because filters, as we all know, are linear, and they just evaluate every digest cycle. So the first time the filter runs, it'll call get localized string, which will cause the file to load. And hopefully, the next time the filter runs, the file will be loaded, and you'll get the output of that token, right? And the nice thing is that this works with ng-cloak, so you can just use the ng-cloak directive if you want, and you'll never see text that's not bound or that's not been compiled by Angular yet on the page, without having to do any extra work with your I18N filter and things like that. So this is nice, but there's a performance issue, right? Because like I just said, filters run every single time that the digest cycle runs. So if you have 100 strings on your page, you're firing 100 filter calls, which are making 100 promise chained ready calls. And even if they resolve in like a couple milliseconds, that's still unnecessary overhead, right? So the other thing is, how often is the user going to change the language in the app? Like once, twice, if he changes to a language by mistake and has to change back. So we don't need the filter to run every single digest cycle. So we came up with this I18N directive. And all the directive does is it's kind of like a single bind. So it evaluates the token, sets the element text to the localized value of that token, and then it waits. It doesn't reevaluate until it finds out that the language was changed, right? So the service already provides this way of telling, it fires an event, it just broadcasts on root scope, an event that says that, hey, the language has changed, and here's the new language, right? So the directive says, oh, OK, the language has changed. Let's trigger a reload, and then set the element text to whatever the new localized version is. So again, this is what I feel is more Angular-like, just doing things on demand instead of having to just evaluate them blindly, hoping that one of the times it will change and you'll catch it. And so you're evaluating 100 times just so that you don't miss that one time when you actually need to catch it, right? So this is, I think, going to solve about 40 or 50% of the issues, right? This is kind of, we've reached a point where we're basically saying whatever the ECMAScript Internationalization API already does, we're just doing that in the context of Angular. But what we really need is to get to edition 2 and beyond of the ECMAScript API before they get there, right? So the first thing is the inline substitutions that I mentioned. So this whole library provides a sort of templating mechanism within your localized versions of your strings. And you can fill those in with variables on your scope. You can either pass in hard-coded strings. But now you have a way of doing inline substitution. You don't have to build hard-coded versions of each and every possibility for each and every string. And it works with both directive and with filter. So again, there are times when you simply have to use a filter, and we support that. But always the suggested solution is to use a directive as much as possible, because then you get the performance benefits. So you simply, in a filter, it's very, very simple. You just pass in the variables as arguments. And in a directive, you reference the data attribute as whatever your template is, right? So in this case, I'm saying percentage full name. And therefore, its data full name is whatever string. And these can both be bound to scope, even though I've just put them as hard-coded strings for just to make it easier to demonstrate. So this one, I'll actually show you guys the plunker. So if you look at this, right, it's my name is Rahul Doshi. The filter and the directive are both outputting the same thing. And when I switch to French, boom, it immediately switches. Both the directive and the filter just implicitly know what to do. And now you can just keep switching back and forth. And it's really clean. It's really simple. If you look at the code for this, it's almost nothing that you have to do on your end. You just have to use the filter approach that you're already familiar with or the directive approach that you're already familiar with. You don't have to learn something new or try and figure out this like, OK, so in some cases, this is the templating we use. In other cases, that's the templating we use. It's just the same APIs, the same stuff that you're already pretty familiar with. This didn't work. So that's the first thing we want to do, right? The next thing is this is all well and good when you're just setting element text. But what about when you're setting other attributes, like in the case of inputs, most commonly, you want to set placeholder text. And you want the prompts to be localized as well, right? Like, please enter your username, please enter your password. Now, Angular has interpolation, so you can always do like HTML attribute equals to open double curly, whatever, and close double curly, right? But in that case, one, you will be using filters within the interpolation, which is slow, as we've already discussed. And two, I think Angular themselves at some point decided to, I believe they deprecated interpolation, and then you saw console errors, and then they kind of went back. But interpolation in general is not advisable because it's heavy, and again, interpolates every digest cycle, if I'm not wrong, if I'm not mistaken, right? Something similar to that. So it's advised to not use interpolation as much as possible, especially within like HTML attributes. So we came up with this I18N attribute solution, which is a directive that is similar to I18N, except that you pass in, instead of just a simple token, you pass in a map of the attribute name that you want to localize, and the token is the value of that attribute name. So in this case, you'll see that I have an input with the I18N attribute set to make the placeholder whatever the email prompt is in that particular language. So again, I'll walk you guys through this example. So if you look at this, right, now that's my I18N text. If you look at the login file, that's what it says. The email prompt is please enter your email address. And now if I change to French, boom, just done. I mean, the attribute just knows, again, how to evaluate, what to look for, and when to change. And it's the same thing that you can keep doing, right? It just goes back and forth between the two. So again, it's sort of similar to the APIs that you're already familiar with, directives that you're already familiar with, and just a new take on those directives, just leveraging the power of those directives to do what you want to do, right? Now, it's very, very tempting when I thought about this a lot, whether to just have it pass in a map or have different attribute directives for different things. And I finally figured out that it's easier to just have one general purpose directive and then use the map. It's really tempting to do like I18N alt for like alt text on an image, I18N title for the title of the image. For a text area, the input might do something slightly different. I mean, the I18N placeholder may do something different, for example. So it's easier to just pass in a map. That way you have less directives that are evaluating on that particular element, because the same directive, let's say you had an image which you did alt text and title text. You could just the I18N attribute directive would do both instead of having two directives, one for alt and one for title. And that keeps it kind of cleaner to read as well. Like, OK, I know at one glance, like placeholder is this, attribute is this, alt text is that, right, for example. So I end up sticking with this, and that way any bugs that you might fix in one version of the attribute directive will automatically implicitly get applied to all versions that you can think of that attribute directive. Not only that, but if you're using third-party libraries that rely on the attributes, like I know UI Bootstrap has like data popover text that you can pass in the text that will be popped over. You can do this. You just do popover text as an attribute inside the map, and this directive, has a higher priority than most other directives in the application. So it'll evaluate first, and then UI Bootstrap will take the right localized string for that particular element, right? So that's the other reason why I chose to stick with this, because then you don't have to keep writing new directives whenever you use a different library, whether you use AngularStrap, UIStrap, it's all going to just work. The other two are sort of experimental, right? So one is, this is my fault. Sorry, guys. Come on, Google Chrome. isn't it? Isn't it Control Tab that does this? Okay, let's do this. Yeah, so the other things that are like slightly more experimental, I just call it experimental because I'm not 100% happy with the implementation yet, is pluralization and then translations based on gender. Right? So let's talk about pluralization. So it's basically depending on the number of people. Like in this case, it'll be one person is viewing, but many people are viewing. Right? So I've taken the same example that Angular uses on their ng-pluralize documentation and try to demonstrate how you can achieve the same thing, but with using this library as well. You don't have to reinvent anything. So the reason I say I'm not happy with it is because in this you see that you still need your controller to save the strings, or at least the token values, right, as strings. And there's a limitation in the lexer that prevents you from like hard coding strings within interpolation within the HTML attribute within an element tag. So it's kind of this convoluted use case that I think nobody's going to encounter in like almost 90% of use cases. So that's why I put the strings in the controller. And then it's the same ng-pluralize syntax that you're already used to. It's just ng-pluralize. The count is whatever input or number that you're getting the count from. And then when it's 0, when it's 1, and it's other, right? And you can set this to be 0, 1, 2, other. ng-pluralize allows some flexibility in that. And so all of that flexibility is supported through here. The only thing that happens is instead of just passing in straight the hard-coded value, you interpolate. In this case, there's no choice but to use interpolation. You interpolate the filter, which is passed through your string tokens are passed through the filter, and the output is what you get. Right? So this is, again, slightly tricky example that I'll walk you guys through. So here we go. So it's one person viewing. Then if you change it to like 3, there's 3 people are viewing. If you change to 0, it's nobody's viewing. And same thing. You can switch from English to French seamlessly. You can do like this, right? And it's using the same ng-pluralize syntax that everybody's already familiar with. If you're not familiar with it, ng-pluralize is pretty well documented. And so I didn't want to, again, reinvent a pluralization directive similar to the I-18N directive, even though that was kind of tempting. Because I don't think I'll do a good job of documenting it and maintaining it as well as the Angular team will. And that way, when Angular moves to 2.0 and they change the way ng-pluralize is, or they make performance improvements to ng-pluralize, you just get those benefits out of the box. Again, just keeping with the ethos of keeping the same API, the same syntax as far as possible that you're already familiar with, and just building a solution on top of that that just helps you achieve whatever you need to achieve. Let's do this every time. So the last thing is gender, right? So gender is also important. I mean, if you've looked at Facebook, really common example is, hey, it's Rahul's birthday, wish him a very happy birthday, or it's Julie's birthday, wish her a very happy birthday, right? So again, it's this wish him versus wish her, or gender neutral pronouns as well, like wish them a happy birthday. I believe like Facebook, somebody brought it up yesterday. So now lets you declare more than like 56 different types of gender. It's not just male or female. It's not just binary anymore. And I guess for social networks, it's important for them to do that. In most use cases, it would just be still a binary male or female. But at least that way, you have the flexibility to support pluralization as well. And again, this is sort of experimental because I haven't really had a chance to play around with it much, think about it much. So it's just a bare bones, simple implementation of how I think gender should be designed. And again, you can use templating to do like wish X Y or whatever you want, right? And then just pass in those strings as and when you need them to be pushed in. So let's look at this example. So basically, now you can do it with either ng-if or ng-switch, right? So if you do it with ng-switch, which I personally think is easier to read and understand, it's just literally your ng-switching on the user.gender, really simple. And you show like one thing when it's male and one thing when it's female. And that one thing is processed through the I18N directive. So in this case, if you look at the directive, when I have M, it's male. The minute I do F, it's female. And I can move from English to French just the same as in all of the other examples. And you can even use ng-if, right? It's just ng-if is a little bit more verbose, where you say, user.gender double equals to M or user.gender double equals to F. But I guess ng-switch is slightly more performant if you had like 10 or 20 options. But ng-switch, especially if you're dealing with like gender neutral stuff, makes it super easy to just do like ng-switch default, right? And this would just, I don't have a string for that, so I'm just going to hard code this one just to show you guys that it works. Just do hello, right? So now, the minute I have no example, it just switches to the gender neutral hello or whatever. You can localize that one as well, obviously. But that way you don't have to do any work to support 56, right? You just support 2, and then the default is just them, right? So that's sort of the additions to this API that I think benefit like the other 40 or 45% of the examples. I think it's still hard to cover like 100% of the use cases, but this thing is open source. It's on GitHub. Feel free to like make a pull request, open an issue. I'll take a look at it or help you guys walk through a problem, discuss a solution. So that's pretty much it. There's just one bonus thing that I wanted to mention. So now imagine that you're localizing for like 10 different languages, right? That means that you expect your developer to commit one translated file per language, right? So that's every time they make a commit, introduce a new string, they're going to be maintaining 10 different JSON files for each string. So we don't want to do that, right? Why do the manual effort when you can easily write an automated task or an automated tool that will just backfill based on whatever's missing, whatever's, you just take like one single source of truth, which is your base locale, which is English, for example. And if you delete something from English, it'll automatically delete from any of the other locales where it's present. If you add to English a file or a key, it'll automatically add in that same place and mirror it in the 9 or 10 different locales that you're choosing to support. So it's called grunt angular localization. I'm going to switch this to a gulp task soon. I just haven't gotten down to it. But it basically just does what I told you. I put this GIF up that kind of demonstrates what it does. So it does 4 things at its very core, right? It creates new files when files are missing from your supported locales. It deletes files that are no longer needed by your supported locale. And it does the same two things for your keys, right? So if there's a key that's in one JSON file, that's your English JSON file, and it's not there in your Japanese one, it'll add that key word for word into the Japanese one. And if it is in the Japanese one but not in the English one, it'll delete that key, right? However, what it doesn't do is it doesn't touch keys that differ. So if there's a key called ABC that is XYZ in the English one and a key called ABC that is PQR in the Japanese one, it leaves those as is because it assumes that your translator is halfway through translating from English to Japanese and has already gone over the ABC translation. So it just leaves all those intact. It's just when it sees something 100% missing from one of the 2 sides, it will knock out those files or tokens. And yeah, that's about it.
All right, Rahul, please come back up for questions.
Yeah.
The only speaker tonight, so this is
it's
all about you.
Talks.
We can bring mics. Both Jeff and I are good at bringing mics to folks, and Angular folks are here too if you have general questions. Does anyone have one? Yes, here in front. Go for it, Jeff.
So you have the I18 directive or the filter. Does it take in additional like locale specific value as well? So imagine you have a page that have different translations. So sometimes you don't rely on what exactly the locale is, but you want different text for different language.
So that's where the fallback comes in, right? So let's say you had English and Japanese, right? And some words you wanted to keep, when you switched to Japanese, you still wanted to keep some strings as in English, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not really switching. It's displaying different translations.
So if you're talking about displaying two different locales on one page, that's not supported because it's just an app level locale switch that we assume that you would make from French to English, the entire app would change. However, if you wanted to say, when I switch from English to French, I still want the name campaign to remain campaign, or the name Google to remain Google. Google's a bad example. But for example, some strings to remain the English version of those strings, you simply, in the French version of that resource file, your key will point to the English value instead of pointing to the French value. And then when you switch to French, it'll just look like it never changed.
Okay.
Right?
Although I guess you could add potentially just an attribute that, hey, force this locale instead.
Yeah, so you could always provide an override. I haven't seen a use for it yet, so I haven't done it. But yeah, of course, it's possible to say, OK, don't load the common dictionary for this particular string, override it with the common dictionary for Japanese or for French. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Rahul. Great talk. A couple of, I guess, long-winded questions. You don't answer
Sure.
them, but what about orientation? I mean, I've heard languages have up and down. I mean, have you looked at CSS or anything that can also help us with that?
So yeah, so orientation and right to left languages,
Right.
like up to down, and RTL is pretty common. Those are things that I haven't supported fully yet. However, like I mentioned before, if you're designing keeping those things in mind, then when you write your HTML and your HTML is responsive, or you build your CSS classes in a way, then that stuff will kind of take care of itself, because even if you had English left to right and you tried to mirror it right to left, you would incur some penalty, and you would have to change your CSS or do some sort of like condition-based ng class. And in that case, you would have an isRTL param, right? That would say whether it's right to left or left to right. And then based on that isRTL, you conditionally set classes or remove classes from those particular elements. So you can still, have the translation just be like a backward version of the RTL thing in the value of your resource files. And then along with the CSS changes or the class changes that you would make in your HTML, it should mitigate most of the issues. I personally haven't tried it yet. I haven't come across it yet. So I'm not confident that it'll be 100%, but I have thought about it. It's not been a huge need for anybody who's using it or myself. And so I haven't tackled that problem yet.
And any thoughts on doing the grunt with making like a Google Translate call and fill out missing?
So yeah, that's the other thing that you can do. So in my experience, Google Translate, while it's good, it's not entirely accurate, right? So it still doesn't replace a translator. But the same way you wrote like I wrote the Angular localized task, you can simply just change that to, instead of just mirroring word for word, it does the intermediate step of making the API call, getting the data back, and then mirroring that data. That should be fairly easy to do. I think you just need to get the API key, because otherwise you'll end up making more calls than Google lets you for free, and that might be a problem.
Right. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Jeff, back in the back there.
Do we provide a my third for configuration, like where is my locale file?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that too much, but let me see if I can. Brian, you want to help me put my slides back up?
Sure.
Thanks. Let's make sure I'm here. So I didn't talk about this, but it does exist, right? So I provide, this is the documentation. Again, it's the link in the slides will point you to the documentation to the complete library, which has more examples and more documentation. But yeah, I do support some stuff as configurable, like what default locale to use, the base path for your resource folder, right? It might not be languages. It might be called locales. It might be called lang, right? So things like that. The shared dictionary file that's loaded at the very beginning, because you assume it's going to be used often. We resort to common by default, but you can change the shared dictionary name. The file extension, I personally prefer doing like .lang.json just to keep it separate from a regular .json file. But you can change that. You can change whether you want to persist the selection to a cookie or not persist the selection. And you can change the cookie name as well. You can change some other stuff. So it's fairly configurable. I've tried to make it as configurable as it makes sense to, without like making it so configurable that people end up overriding huge chunks of the library, and at that point it's just like, just fork my library and just replace the parts that you need. But yes, to answer your question, it is fairly configurable, and I think, I mean, I don't see any reason why you should need more configuration options than this.
Yeah.
But if you do, just open a pull request, and I'll be happy to take a look at it.
We store the setting by using cookie, right?
Yeah, we store it in the cookie. Yeah.
So we rely on Angular cookie or
Yes,
something?
I rely on ng cookies.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Translation of, oops, thank you. I was wondering where you got the translation of the word desktop in French, because I don't think it's correct.
Oh, then I need to talk to my, so actually my CTO is French, and he gave me the translation.
Because
But I didn't look at Google Translate, though.
Up in France,
Oh, okay.
and I don't think it's correct.
Because, all right, I should actually change that, because this is in production, so I should probably change that.
So yeah, it's a very good library. Do you provide a service that I can use inside a controller?
Yes. So the first thing I talked about was it's called Locale, not $locale, just Locale. And that's the first example I talked about was, let me go back here. Somewhere here, right? So, oh, sorry, not this one. So this is the first one. The first example I talked about was using just the Locale service, right? And I can show you the plunker. So remember how I talked about you have to use locale.ready, though. In that case, you have to wrap all your string call, your get localized calls within the ready. So ready returns a promise that will just resolve once whatever file you're relying on has been successfully loaded into memory. And if you look at the code here for this, so you have to do two things, right? One is you have to wrap everything in a .ready so that you make sure you're not evaluating stuff before it's finished loading. The second is you need to have your scope listen in on language changes. So if the user changes the language from English to French, and redo that entire process of reevaluating all the strings. But yeah, you can use a service. And in fact, the service is the only way that you can set a new locale or get the currently set locale back from this library.
Okay, another question. Do you provide a way to load like partials? Like, let's say that my file for translations is like 2,000 lines, and I just want to show one line that is in the login page.
So yeah, so that's the other thing I talked about in the beginning was like the flat JSON structure. So I've tried not, I mean, the whole point is to not have one large file, but to break up your file however you see fit, whether it's based on route or based on module, or if you have a single page which is composed of many different sections, maybe break it up even further as within that module, the different sections have a locale file for each or a resource file for each. And that way you keep your files small enough that you can call them sort of partials for your whole dictionary. So basically, it would look something like this. Right? So it would look something like this, where ENUS is basically think of it as your dictionary. And within your dictionary, each of those JSON files is a partial. So your login.json will have maybe only like 15 or 20 strings, and your home.json might have 100 strings. And if you find that your home.json has 1,000 strings, then maybe you need to, if you have like 6 widgets on your home page, each widget will have its own .json file instead of just having a large home.json file. So yeah, you could, in theory, have like 10,000 strings and have 10,000 different JSON files, and each JSON file is just one string. But then you'll be making a lot of HTTP calls. So you kind of need to just figure out the trade-off in terms of how many gets you want to make to JSON files versus how big you want your JSON files to be.
Cool, thanks.
I got a couple questions. First of all is I see that you provide default locale, but does it do fall through? For example, if I have localization only for EN, but
Right.
And then I have specific string for a particular region, but then the rest of them are needs to be fall through to the
So
default?
that's a good question, actually. So there's two things that I do to mitigate that issue. One is, of course, the grunt task will create a mirror of each locale you want to support. So if you want to support JP, and ENUS, but you don't have a translator for JP yet, you just, when somebody switches from English to Japanese, it just loads up the Japanese files, which are nothing but English, and it's transparent to the user. But let's say you want to support English US, and you want it to English Great Britain to fall back on English US. You can actually set, where is it gone? There is a configuration that you can set in, I think I might not have documented it here, but there is a configuration you can set for like only English, which locale you wanted to fall back. So in that case, you would say anything that starts with EN, whether it's ENUS, ENGB, ENJP, will fall back on ENUS. Similarly, anything FR, whether it's FR Canada, FR France, will fall back on FR France. And that way, you have like two levels of fallback, right? You either have the fallback at like compile time, which is through the grunt task, or you have the fallback at runtime, which is any English language translates to English US if you don't support the other versions. And if you do, then it just is transparent to the user.
Okay. So the other question I have is, you mentioned caching. So how exactly are you doing the caching, and does it use local storage?
No, so it doesn't use local storage yet. I tend to not use local storage because it's not being supported in that many browsers. When I wrote this library, it was even in less browsers. Now it's way more predominant. But it just stores it in memory. So every time you load a JSON file, it loads the JSON into a map of maps. So you would have like your big map, which would be your dictionary. And within the dictionary, you would have a separate map for common, a separate map for login, a separate map for home. And then when you change your language, it just clears that entire map and starts all over again. So that way you don't keep on adding to the map. It's not like it's ENUS common something, ENUS home something, and then as you load more and more locales, it grows and grows.
So you make sure you check if it's defined already.
Yes,
before
yeah,
loading.
if it's defined, I don't make the call, I just return. That's why the ready is there, right? So the ready will resolve immediately if we've already stored that file in memory. If not, it will wait to load the file and then resolve.
We'll go over here.
Thank you for a great talk, Rahul. You're obviously very knowledgeable in the area. Have you thought about both server-side localization and client-side localization? Because lots of localization can be done on the server. So what you're doing is primarily or pretty much all client-side.
Yes.
So any suggestions in that
so
area?
I did. So there's two parts there, right? One is the server-side stuff that only goes so much of the way, right? Because if you're doing server-side, you're basically compiling a different version of your app for each locale you want to support, and then you would do like /en/index.html /fr/index.html, etc. But in that case, you can't do dynamic strings, right? When you have like hello XYZ, you can't hard code hello XYZ. So you hard code hello, and then you do like this double curly, and then you serve the or you template it somehow, and you serve it, and then you let Angular take care of the rest, which is one way of doing it, which to me is kind of clunky because you're involving two. Now you're doing templating on the server side to fill in the strings, and then you're doing templating yet again on the client side because the variables have to be filled in dynamically. And to me, that seems a little bit more messy than it should. So that's one reason. The other reason is that I want to keep with the ethos of Angular that you can literally take your entire Angular app and deploy it on Apache and connect it to like a REST endpoint, and it'll run. You don't need to have like a Node Express server that's serving up templates or serving up partials. You can just put it all on a static file server or a CDN even, and just have it run, right? And this allows you to keep doing that, right? You don't need to invest in like having now servers on AWS or bare metal servers that are just doing nothing but serving up your application. You can just keep doing what you're doing, deploying a 100% client-side Angular app, and just having it work the way you're always used to having it work.
Thank you.
Cool. More questions? All right. Oh, one here in the front. Great.
Thanks a lot for this talk. It was really wonderful. One question though, but about the phrases you mentioned that I think you recommended to use phrases instead of words
Right.
in the JSON files. as a key. So, I mean, how how should one decide, because there are so many languages, so it's going to be a very difficult job to write whether you should use which phrase to use or.
So that's why I always think of it as the simplest way of thinking about it is that anything that you're like, let's say you have a P tag, right? And you have like 3 sentences within that P tag. I would say that entire block, whether it's 3 or 5 sentences, becomes one key in your JSON file. So yeah, your JSON file will be slightly bigger, and that's when you resort to breaking it down even further into partials of the partials, so to speak. But that way, no matter what happens, like think about it this way: if you let's say you had 3 sentences in that paragraph, right? And you treated each sentence as a token. When you switch from, like 1 year down the line, when you switch from English to Chinese, you find that in Chinese, you say the same thing in 2 sentences. Now, what happens to the third one, right? You could make it a fake token, which is just nothing but an empty string. But that's a pretty simple example, right? What if you had space constraints, or that's why you broke things down into sentences or into phrases within the sentence, right? Like you had two phrases separated by a semicolon. You said, OK, it's semicolon, so one phrase. And in Chinese, you realize that it's one big thing. Where does the semicolon go? Does it disappear? Are you treating it as a separate delimiter? What happens, right? So the easiest way, in my opinion, to think about it is that anything you put between in the element text, like element.text, literally, or whatever you call element.getText on, that whole thing is treated as one token or one block of text, right? Think of it as a block. And that way, I think it'll lead to the least problems.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody, so much. We're going to be around for the next couple minutes if you want to have one-on-one questions. Thanks for coming. I hope to see you next time.
Thanks, guys.